One reckless move too far. The story of Gulf Air 072. On the 23rd of August 2000, Gulf Air Flight 072, an Airbus A320-212, crashed in the Arabian Gulf near Muharraq, Bahrain. GF 072 departed from Cairo International Airport, Cairo, Egypt, with 2 pilots, 6 cabin crew, and 135 passengers on board for Bahrain International Airport, Muharraq, and Kingdom of Bahrain. GF 072 was operating as a regularly scheduled international passenger service flight under the Convention on International Civil Aviation and the provisions of Sultanate of Oman Civil Aviation Regulations, Part 121, and was on an instrument flight rules flight plan. The airplane had been cleared to land on runway 12 at BAH, but crashed at sea about 3 miles northeast of the airport soon after, initiating a go-around following the second landing attempt. The airplane was destroyed by impact forces, and all 143 persons on board were killed. Today, we're diving into the tragic incident of Gulf Air Flight 072, which took place back in 2000. This flight was en route from Bahrain to Cairo when it met a disastrous fate. Buckle up, because we're about to explore the investigation into what led to this heartbreaking event. Alright, Gulf Air Flight 072 was a scheduled international passenger flight from Cairo International Airport in Egypt to Bahrain International Airport in Bahrain, operated by Gulf Air. On the 23rd of August 2000 at 1930 Arabia Standard Time, the Airbus A320 crashed minutes after executing a go-around upon failed attempt to land on runway 12. The flight crew suffered from spatial disorientation during the go-around and crashed into the shallow waters of the Persian Gulf, 2 kilometers from the airport. All 143 people on board the aircraft were killed. Let's set the scene. On August 23rd, 2000, on the afternoon of the 23rd of August that year, a Gulf Air Airbus A320, registered as A4OEK, began boarding at the gate in Cairo, Egypt, for Flight 072 to Bahrain. In command was 37-year-old Captain Ihsan Shakib, a Bahraini national with around 4,400 flying hours, of which just 85 were as pilot in command. As far as A320 captains are concerned, it would be hard to find many who were less experienced, and his Omani co-pilot, 25-year-old First Officer Khalaf al-Alawi, was even newer, with only 608 flight hours, so Captain Shakib knew he would need to be on top of his game. Flight 072 departed from Cairo at 16:52 local time, with 143 passengers and crew on board. The aircraft approached the landing at higher speeds than normal, initially at 313 knots, and then decreasing to 272 knots. At 19:22, the MAM approach gave the flight approval for self-navigation to land on runway 02. First Officer Al-Alawi then contacted Bahrain approach, informing that they would be landing on runway 02. The approach was too high, and the flight crew carried out an unusual low-altitude orbit in an attempt to correct the approach. The orbit was unsuccessful, and a go-around was attempted. While carrying out a turning climb, the aircraft entered a descent at 15 degrees nose down. The Ground Proximity Warning System, GPWS, activated, first sounding a sink rate alarm, and then 9 whoop-whoop pull-up alarms, which continued to sound until impact. There were 2 pilots in the aircrew. The pilot in command was 37-year-old Bahraini Captain Ihsan Shakib. The first officer was 25-year-old Omani Khalaf al-Alawi. Among the 135 passengers were 61 men, 37 women, and 37 children. A 144th set of remains was found and was identified as a fetus that had been delivered during the crash. But this was not counted as a fatality in the final report. The crash of Flight 072 remains the deadliest aviation accident in Bahraini territory and was the deadliest accident involving an Airbus A320 at the time, which was later surpassed by TAM Airlines Flight 3054, which crashed on the 17th of July 2007 with 199 fatalities. Let's back to the story. At 16:52 local time, Flight 072 finally departed, 52 minutes behind schedule. The delay, which pushed their expected landing in Bahrain deeper into the hours of darkness, may have played an unexpected role in the tragedy which followed. The flight east to Bahrain was uneventful, as the sun set behind them at 18:06 and night fell over Arabia. By 1921, Flight 072 was well into its descent and in contact with approach control in the city of Dammam, on the coast of Saudi Arabia, across the strait from Bahrain. Descending out of 14,000 feet, the crew received permission from Dammam to begin their approach. Captain Shakib acknowledged the clearance, which allowed them to navigate to the start of the approach for runway 12 at Bahrain, descend to 3,500 feet, and contact Bahrain approach control. Signing off, Shakib said, "Have a good day," then turned to his first officer. "Call Bahrain and tell them we are going for runway 12, he ordered. Normally, flights were cleared down to 3,500 feet by Dammam before the handoff to Bahrain, and the controller wanted to confirm that this was the case. But Captain Shakib had a different impression. In response, Bahrain cleared them to continue the descent to 3,500 feet. But Captain Shakib seemed to have planned the descent thus far in the belief that they would only be cleared to 7,000 feet, and now they needed to scramble to get down. Consequently, Shakib pitched down and descended rapidly, causing their speed to increase. As the pilots ran through more checks, the controller cleared them to descend to 1,500 feet and asked them to report established on the VOR-DME approach. First Officer Al-Alawi acknowledged. The pilots then reviewed their target speed indicators, or bugs, checked their seatbelts, and confirmed their altimeters were correctly set. All appeared normal. By 1925, Flight 072 had lined up with the runway from a distance of 9 nautical miles, but their airspeed was out of control, reaching a blistering 313 knots following their rapid descent. According to the proper VOR-DME approach procedure, they needed to be stabilized and fully configured for landing by the final approach fix, or FAF, which was located at 5 nautical miles from the runway. In this case, fully stabilized and configured meant on course at an altitude of 1,500 feet and a speed of 136 knots, with the flaps and landing gear fully extended. It should have been obvious that they would be unable to meet these targets. They had perhaps a minute in which to lose more than half their airspeed, which was completely impossible, especially given that they were also too high. Just 4 miles from the FAF, they were still at 1,800 feet, but the only way to get down to 1,500 was to descend faster, which would cause their speed to increase even more. And if they couldn't get their speed below 177 knots, they would also be unable to fully extend the flaps, which provide extra lift for low-speed flight. Despite the self-evident fact that they could not stabilize the approach, Captain Shakib pressed onward. Their speed was 223 knots instead of 136. They were 162 feet too high, and the flaps were still in position 1. At this point, standard operating procedures called for the pilots to make a missed approach, circle back, and try again. But instead, Shakib announced visual with the airfield and switched from VOR-DME approach procedures to visual approach procedures. Shakib may have been exploiting the fact that a visual approach, flown by eye, only requires that the flight path be stabilized and the plane fully configured by an altitude of 500 feet, which in this case would be 1.7 miles from the runway. The flight directors assist pilots in flying an instrument approach or other standardized procedure by generating command bars on the primary flight display, which tell the pilot to fly up, down, left, or right in order to achieve a certain pre-programmed course or aircraft attitude. But in a visual approach, there was no need for them, so he made Al-Alawi turn them off. At this point, the proper course of action would be to level off, fly straight ahead, climb to 2,500 feet, and circle around for another attempt, which was the standard missed approach procedure for runway 12. But that would involve admitting defeat, and Captain Shakib wasn't ready to do that instead. Shakib's plan was to salvage the approach by making a 360-degree left orbit, buying time to lose airspeed and altitude before circling back to finish the approach. Earlier in the approach, this would have been a prudent move, but by now, at an altitude of just 584 feet and barely 1 mile from the runway threshold, it was much too late. In fact, standard operating procedures prohibited this sort of maneuvering after passing the FAF, but that wasn't going to stop him. At that moment, Captain Shakib began turning the aircraft to the left, initiating the orbit at a distance of 0.9 nautical miles from the runway. As he did so, he called for flaps 3, then flaps full, bringing the airplane into the proper landing configuration. However, his manual flying skills appeared less than stellar. He was unable to maintain a consistent bank angle or pitch attitude, and at first the plane climbed to 965 feet before descending sharply. The bank angle reached 36 degrees, beyond the value normally used in flight, which would have been disconcerting to the passengers. And to make matters worse, once they had turned around, the lights of Bahrain disappeared behind them, and the pilots were faced with a black hole, as the empty waters of the Persian Gulf on a moonless night provided no visual references. Nevertheless, as Captain Shakib manhandled the plane through the orbit, the pilots hurried through the landing checklist, calling landing checklist complete at 1928 and 28 seconds. However, trying to make a tight circle at low altitude with no outside reference and at full flaps, which decreased maneuverability, was far from easy, and it was clear that Shakib had bitten off more than he could chew. His control inputs were large and erratic, and in the end, he leveled out too early, bringing the plane out of the orbit after turning only 270 degrees, rather than 360. Having descended to an altitude of 332 feet, the plane was now flying perpendicular to the runway course, with zero hope of landing. Several seconds went by as Captain Shakib searched for the runway before he eventually found it, far to their left. Having recognized the inconvenient truth of their situation, Shakib had finally decided to perform a go-around, climbing away to start their approach again. The time was 19:29 and 8 seconds. Within seconds, the engines spooled up to take off /go-around or toga power, propelling the airplane up and away. But not all was done by the book. Proper procedure called for the pilot to maintain 15 degrees pitch up during the go-around, but their actual pitch attitude never reached this value. Instead, the acceleration from the A320's low-slung engines momentarily pushed the nose up to 13. 7-8, before Captain Shakib eased it back down to just 5 ha's, well below the normal value. Now, with the plane in a very shallow climb, with the engines set to nearly full power, their airspeed began to increase rapidly, much faster than the pilots were probably expecting. As this was happening, the crew continued to work through the missed approach checklist, reconfiguring their airplane for the climb. Speed check, positive climb, gear up, First Officer Al-Alawi called out, and a rumble in the background confirmed that the gear was retracting. But at 19:29 and 41 seconds, before First Officer Al-Alawi could answer the captain's question, a continuous, repetitive chime began to sound, warning that they were flying too fast with the flaps in position 3. Simultaneously, a caution message appeared on the screen of their Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitoring System, or ECAM. In response, First Officer Al-Alawi called out, "Speed, over speed limit," in the middle of a go-around. In an already high workload situation, the flap overspeed warning was the last thing Captain Shakib needed. He let out an expletive, cutting into a transmission from air traffic control. "And contact approach, 12785, sir." During the crucial 5-second period between 19 hours 29 minutes and 40 seconds and 19 hours 29 minutes and 45 seconds, several things happened all at once. At 19:29 and 41 seconds, at exactly the same time as the flap overspeed alarm sounded, with the plane in a climbing left turn back away from the runway, the last visible lights disappeared from view. replaced by the pitch-black expanse of the Persian Gulf. At that point, the only way for the pilots to determine their attitude was by referring to the attitude indicators on their primary flight displays, or PFDs. However, between their attempts to set the flaps and identify the reason for the flap overspeed problem, it is unlikely that they were looking at them. Instead, the sudden loss of visual references caused Captain Shakib to experience what is known as a somatogravic illusion. Although the flight envelope protections averted an outright loss of control, their altitude peaked at about 1,050 feet, and the plane began to descend. First Officer Al-Alawi had just called out "Speed checks, flaps 3, when suddenly the Ground Proximity Warning System, or GPWS, announced "Sink rate," and then, with a sickening crunch, Gulf Air Flight 072 ploughed directly into the Persian Gulf, pitched 6.5 degrees nose down and travelling at a speed of 280 knots. The high-speed impact ripped the plane apart in the blink of an eye, sending shattered debris tumbling and cartwheeling through the shallow water. By the time it came to a halt, all 143 passengers and crew were dead, consumed by the night dark sea. News of the crash spread quickly, as the accident's repercussions shook the entire Gulf region and beyond. Bahrain declared 3 days of national mourning over what had proven to be among the tiny country's worst peacetime disasters, and distraught crowds gathered at the airport in Cairo, desperate for news of their loved ones. At the accident site, some 4 kilometers northeast of the airport, rescue teams and divers sifted through debris under about 3 meters of water, searching for the bodies of the victims. And amid all of this activity, Bahrain appointed a special commission of inquiry to carry out the most important task of all, finding the cause of the accident so that it may never happen again. When investigators reviewed the contents of the black boxes, they learned that after the go-around was initiated, the plane climbed slightly, then simply descended straight into the sea while fully under control. Obviously, a pilot would not intentionally put the plane into such a steep descent during a go-around when the objective is to climb. This put Captain Shakib, as the flying pilot, in a situation where the workload was extremely intense. It was also clear that he lacked manual flying experience, given his large and sometimes erratic inputs, which resulted in excessive bank angles and a presumably unwanted increase in altitude. It was at this point that Shakib first began to lose situational awareness. Having apparently lost track of his position, he rolled out of the orbit on a heading perpendicular to the runway course. And even after the first officer called out "runway in sight," it took him around 10 seconds to find it. By now he was becoming frustrated and anxious, as evidenced by his repeated swearing, and he was probably approaching the limit of his flying knowledge and ability. How is it that a pilot could simply ignore an alarm telling him that he's about to crash? Such things occasionally happen when the pilot is, for whatever reason, expecting a false alarm. But this was clearly not the case on Flight 072. Instead, investigators theorized that against all odds, Shakib and Al-Alawi simply never heard the warnings. The final report was issued on the 15th of August 2002, concluded that the individual factors contributed to the accident was non-adherence to a number of standard operating procedures, SOP, and loss of spatial and situational awareness by the aircraft crew during the approach and final phases of the flight. A number of systemic factors were also contributed to the accident, including deficiency in crew resource management, CRM, training by Gulf Air and safety oversights by the Directorate General of Civil Aviation and Meteorology of Oman. The accident was caused by a combination of factors, including: our aim in this section is definitely not to blame or judge the people mentioned for their mistakes. It is only to identify the problems that occurred in aviation in the events that took place, and to explain these problems and reveal their reasons. As a final result, we aim to contribute to the safety culture in aviation. Pilot error. The captain of the flight, Captain Ihsan Shakib, made a number of errors during the approach and go-around. Errors was flying the aircraft at a high speed and failing to maintain a stable attitude. Spatial disorientation. Captain Ihsan Shakib and the first officer, Khalaf Al-Alawi, Both suffered from spatial disorientation during the go-around. It is a common phenomenon for pilots who are flying in darkness or low visibility conditions. After the accident, Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa, the Emir of Bahrain, declared 3 days of national mourning. Gulf Air retired the Flight 072, GF072 flight number and replaced it with Flight 070, GF070 for inbound flights from Cairo to Bahrain. Now it's your turn. What are your thoughts on aviation safety? Do you think enough is being done to prevent disasters like this? Drop your comments below. And if you found this video insightful, don't forget to check out our other videos on aviation disasters and safety tips.